I have titled my presentation, The Great Digital Transformation, Enclosing the Archival Commons. Clearly it's ripped off from Carl Polanyi, but it may help us see some aspects of archival research. If increasingly we regard information and knowledge as a commercial property, then it must now be appropriate to consider the question of inclusion and exclusion in terms of access to society's archival repositories. Does digitization necessarily increase access for research and the public? My approach here is based on years of experience at archival research, and my point of view is not that of a social theorist, nor do I have credentials in library sciences or have any familiarity with the archival sciences literatures. In other words, I'm barely qualified to participate. The claims I make here today are based on one, experience as an archive-focused researcher, but also in respect of other parties that have some real-life interest stakes in the course and the outcomes that can be generated from archival-based research. My engagement with archives has developed over the last several decades as one, a graduate student producing theses, ongoing historical research as a member of the Academy, applied research in the course of litigating treaty and Aboriginal rights, and formally instructing students in dedicated methods courses on how to conduct archival research. In the summer of 1977, I had my first brush with the records of the Hudson's Bay Company. Then, the post-account balance sheets revealed the mysteries of mercantile profits and the exploitation of native trappers, and of course, spoke volumes on the present-day situation of native communities. But really, after nearly 4 decades on, the intricacies of the accounting books remain somewhat of a mysterious reflection of capital accumulation. Most of my archival experience concerns the Hudson's Bay Company, which is part of the Archives of Manitoba and is located in Winnipeg, and the records of the Department of Interior and Department of Indian Affairs. They're in the custody today of Library and Archives Canada. I've done a lot of work with censuses. Most of my critical commentary will focus on these 2 repositories. And because I have come to understand that Aboriginal history cannot be properly understood from even the most skeptical consideration of Department of Indian Affairs documents, I advocate that a variety of state entities need to be consulted to understand the state as a historical agency of colonialism. Thus, I've come to know my way around many other record groups, especially Department of Interior, Fisheries, and Justice. As a historical geographer, I have an interest in manuscript and published maps and plans, and it would seem to be some of interest that maps are vital sources that relate to how colonialism dispossesses. Maps and plans present particular challenges for indexing and cataloging, and even bigger problems for researchers when most of this material is not accessible decades after acquisition. I am also the principal investigator for the Métis Archival Project Lab, or the MAP Lab, that specializes in inquiring, compiling, and digitizing archival records. The lab built an online historical database for the Métis National Council. It has focused on the Métis, and it uses archival records in the course of litigation of Métis Aboriginal rights. And we are involved with the land claim for the Métis of Northwest Saskatchewan. So I caution you here, if your expectation is that I am a standard, objective and value-free member of the Academy, I've been involved with litigation research. And significantly, a team of researchers from the MAP Lab served as a trial Library and Archives Canada project, and we were the first researchers allowed to digitize LAC records. Moreover, I've taken several classes of undergraduate students for a 9-day intensive research methods course to Library and Archives Canada. In terms of access, I recall when I was a graduate student that that reading room was open 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. Sadly for my students, it's generally only open from 8 in the morning to about 11 at night, and they actually spend the time in the archives conducting their own research. Here I attempt to organize my disagreement with the current state of archives around the theme of access. It offers a preliminary assessment of whether the public interest created by its state agencies, as well as other records that have come into the custody of archival repositories, shall be well served by recent transformations, much enabled by exaggerated claims about the wonders of digitization. And it's an opportunity to share some of my joys of archival research as well as my frustrations that lie not so much with the quality of the document or the quality of the information, but with restrictions on access. Broadly, we have to consider the separation of researchers and archivists, which as I've seen in my own experiences, as well as the separation of archivists, which we now refer to as record managers, from the documents and history generally. My argument here is based on personal experience. It is highly anecdotal. It is not based on the standards of social science research. And certainly many of my examples are not generalizable to other jurisdictions. I also want to thank Pat Demers for keeping me in this project and her patience with my participation. And prior to making my concerns about the present state of archives, I want to state clearly, myself, research assistants, undergraduate students have received tremendous support and consideration by the staff of both the National Archives of Canada and later Library and Archives Canada. Now, arguments for expenditure of public funds on archives might be made by, one, considering the value of historical records as artifacts, two, accepting the public's right to know what the state is up to, three, providing information on the ancestry of individuals, or four, acknowledging the direct and indirect benefits the society receives from an ongoing diversity of historical interpretations ranging from specific microstudies to grand explanations. The first case concerns preservation. Priorities are made based on a custodial framework. I refer to this as archives for archivists. On its own, this amounts to an abstract appraisal disassociated from some of the needs of a democratic society. And while a few documents may have high artifactal value in commercial terms and require special and expensive custody, I believe a stronger justification for the preservation of state and other influential historical records is a value that only comes through the labor of researchers. These various justifications for public archives are not inherently contradictory, although I do appreciate that fragile documents are more easily preserved if the researchers are kept away. A few years back, the Hudson's Bay Company and the Hudson's Bay Company itself and the government of Manitoba celebrated the anniversary of the arrival of the Hudson's Bay Company documents to its new home at the Provincial Archives of Manitoba in Winnipeg, in which made Winnipeg a world-class city because it had a world-class archives. And I attended this event. Much fanfare was made about the generosity of the Hudson's Bay Company, and recent donations were acknowledged. The absence of any official representation from the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs and the Manitoba Métis Federation was not hard to miss. But also, not a single researcher was on the program. This deliberate exclusion, marginalization, I think is a polite classification, demonstrates that the publishing activities of researcher count for nothing at such celebratory events. It reflects a separation of archivists and researchers. Let's move through this. Yes, we've had the courses. Digitization can be very good. The old Public Records Office in the United Kingdom has an excellent website. You can access many records. With respect to the Colonial Office, we get 1.8 million results. You can narrow the search down, Red River Settlement, and we get a very nice, terse explanation with some good metadata, some good explanations. The numbering system follows through. You can see the documents that were created within sequence. It provides some good contextual context to the collection. And another amazing thing about this site and the UK is that many local regional archives are also included and are made from an information point of view accessible online. Okay. So the ability of researchers to write and publish is dependent upon access. An intelligent and well-designed system of access will facilitate the work of researchers. Poorly designed systems and that is easily achieved by not consulting researchers, will frustrate productivity. So access for researchers and the public concern permission to access based on law, the ability to identify and locate relevant records from the repositories, and the ease in seeing originals or readable copies. And of course, colored digital photography produces the best copy as a facsimile of the original document. So digitization as a technology has the potential for increasing access, and I just mentioned that I found the system in the United Kingdom for the National Archives, formerly known as the Public Records Office, quite good. Now, while unrelated to digital technology, the first assault on the public's right to know what its state has been up to historically has been so-called access legislation. Previously, in the case of the Public Records Office, a 30-year rule closed state records to public scrutiny, thereby providing a decent distance between policy and the messy details of management implementation. But with a few exceptions, the records were open after 30 years. However, if you needed to see records of a more recent origin, it would not be helpful. And a crucial aspect of legal access here is that these records pass to the control of the archives, and permission does not remain with the department or the branch that created the records. Consider, if the Department of Indian Affairs still controlled access to archival documents, we should rather doubt that we would have learned very much about what happened at residential schools. My first experience with federal access process came as a result of my interest in a series of Justice Department legal opinions, which I attempted to access in the early 1990s. And eventually I did obtain access to some of this material. It was a bit of a test case. Would the Federal Justice Department maintain control of these records with the public archives simply serving as a convenient storage facility? Or would researchers have access to an important series of documents that relate to our legal history? Since existing correspondence between the Department of Indian Affairs and the Justice Department had led me to believe that the Justice Department was providing arguments to Indian Affairs that would permit Indian Affairs a defense of treaty rights against provincial encroachment, I was interested in these records. This legal advice seems to have been ignored by Indian Affairs officials. I was looking for more detail. I always believe you try and turn over every stone. And the internal analysis of the Justice Department might have been helpful. In particular, the question of commercial rights was at issue. In this instance, solicitor-client privilege was invoked, so the legal opinion written on the 22nd of July, 1897 was removed from the file. So this is it here. The reason for the removal is given, the section of the Act is cited, and you're simply notified that you don't have access to it. And there is a system of preferential access. As a consultant to the Ontario government in the early 1990s, I got access to criminal case files that I would not have gotten access to as a university researcher. But based on my experience, the most obstructionist access legislation has been created by the province of Manitoba. As a minor participant in a project concerning caribou hunting regulations, the blunt force of access denial was felt. Unlike the federal legislation when access unit was part of the archives, the Manitoba legislation allowed the department unit that created the records to retain access over these records. The access control person took their job very seriously, and they were well aware that my inquiry potentially related to Indian hunting rights and caribou management. Eventually, I received the documents. So here we have a request, here we have a form letter back, and here we have one of the records that I received. This concerned regulations about caribou hunting in the 1950s. And you can see it's been redacted, as has this one here. It's been redacted. Now the interesting thing is that what they redacted, they really didn't understand. And these were simply typescript copies of what was published in the Gazetteer about hunting regulations. Now, by way of comparison, the CIA's 201 file, a pre-assassination file on Lee Harvey Oswald, actually seems to have been less redacted than caribou hunting in northern Manitoba, and it was opened in 1992. So digitization, if we move on from the issue of legal access, can increase access. And like any technology, requires careful application. And I would ask, are these search functions designed for archivists or researchers? And certainly the very early confederated database between the library holdings and what was formerly known as the National Archives and the archival holdings, it was known formerly as the National Archives, were really problematic. And you would get one document per page with tons of metadata description, repetitive wording. So, for example, digital finding aids would be better than the handwritten shelf lists that usually formed the initial finding aids. When I began archival research, type finding aids were rare, and that's not because the typewriter didn't exist, although RG10 was accessible in other formats. To illustrate successful digitization, hundreds of pages of the mainframe printout of records of the Lands Patents Branch, the Department of Interior, were a huge improvement in speeding up research for indexing of these records, even though we were simply looking at hard copy. Searching online also provides productivity advantages. Nevertheless, the content and organization of finding aids, and this one in particular, the RG15 finding aid of the Lands Patents Branch, from a researcher's point of view, the crucial elements were more than just digitization. Whether a finding aid is handwritten, mainframe printouts, or web interface database would not matter much if the structure and content did not provide researchers with adequate descriptions. When the National Archives of Canada developed a series of online archive-specific finding aids known as ArchiveNet, the speed of identification of relative records was increased. One of the access issues, I believe strongly, is the separation of researcher and archivist. And when I began doing research in what was then Public Archives of Canada, now known as Library and Archives Canada, the Government Archives Division, which is a pool of archivists that specialized in the RG groups, such as RG10, Department of Indian Affairs, and they were located in this leaky building, which now has many false fire alarms that can shut down your research for a day. And then they were moved over here temporarily, and you could phone over or you could come over and visit and call upon one of the portfolio archivists. Well, someone had the good idea to move this agency far, far away from the actual records into another province. This is actually a spatial separation of the archivist and the researcher. Now, a poorly designed, in my opinion, search database is the Hudson's Bay Company Archives, which has been conflated with General Manitoba Government Archive. This is obviously a very attractive sort of interface for the user. And then you have rather weak kind of summaries. You get a bit more description in here, but I found these rather hard to access, and none of my researchers like it. We basically have the view that it's not facilitating research. And you can go with a keyword like this, and you get the Hudson's Bay Company listings here for Norway House. Now, one of the things here that I think reflects a sloppy digitization, which is the concern is with the archivist and not the researcher, is that 14 documents here with this date range are on this microfilm reel. So if you're thinking in terms of microfilm reels, it's very handy. If you want to know which particular document is covering which particular period, it's been obscured by the way they've constructed the data. Because I may not want to see 20 years, 30 years of documents. I'm trying to find a particular one. However, and the other thing that's a bit discouraging about this source is they have a very well structured system of alphanumeric system of naming the records, grouping the records. And it has a logic to it, and it's understood by researchers. And when you cite this system, it's very clear to those semi-informed readers about what document you're using. This is all about to change, and they're using a barcode number, which actually tells you nothing about the nature of the document except where to find it in the vault. And that's what you're expected to use in a footnote. It's not very helpful online. So there are degrees of facility and access depending on the design of the database. However, with the creation of digital finding aids, very quickly old skills acquired only by time spent poring over finding aids and other hard copy in the archives disappeared. The ability to locate relevant archival records have been de-skilled. Almost any person can punch in a term in the search engine. And also diminished in certain respects was a host of printed descriptions of archival holdings that allowed researchers to see the larger context of the archival holdings. For example, the Blue Book inventories provided the administrative history of department ministries associated with particular record groups. Prior knowledge of the structure of archival holdings remained relevant to these modern research engines, but it could not really be acquired by merely punching in a bunch of search terms in the search fields. Moreover, the fact that many finding aids were not digitized and did not exist on the original web interface would not have dawned on most of the unskilled researchers. The adoption of FOND in place of record group or manuscript group has obscured more than it's revealed. As a researcher, it's not clear to me why what has been achieved. It has, however, initially disrupted the continuity of referencing archival documents. To illustrate, the Public Archives of Canada has designated all accessions by the Department of Indian Affairs as Record Group 10. Any footnote reference with RG10 will signal to the semi-informed reader that the document has been created by the Department of Indian Affairs. It's fine to concatenate records as collections with an obscure acronym, but the record groups in Library and Archives Canada, I feel, already did that. It is also a disconnect not to have specific research fields for RG10 and MG manuscript. It is my impression that the current research interface has restored the possibility to search by older descriptions, and this metadata has not been eliminated. So let's have a look at some of this. So this is the current interface with the Library and Archives Canada. It's much better. It's improved in the last little while. It was actually hard. There was so much quasi-advertising for the institution. It was actually hard to get at the catalog or the online search. That's improved. They've kind of conflated things. Library and archives research are the basic division, and it reflects the problem of the hybrid nature of this institution. But they've thrown some other things in here in the drop-down menu. The earlier ArchiviaNet, I think, was very good, and whenever we can, we actually use this as a backdoor to do searching, even though nothing has been added to it since 2004. And most of my researchers employed in the lab start with this if they can get to this. For me, the key thing, there was two ways to focus in on the record group. And you could use a volume, and it had keywords, and you could put a file number in here. A file number in here with a record group was a good way of backstreaming a search. Now we have something like search all. This is kind of the mind Googles type mentality, where a single field will actually tell us something. Now admittedly, this is the basic search. There are other ways of searching. And if we put in the word Métis, from the library we get almost 13,000, we get almost 43,000 here. And then we get, and I never know why things are sequenced this way. So if someone were to plow through the tens of thousands of records here, it's not clear why they're sequenced the way they are. Now, fortunately, and I say that their archive search has been enhanced. It's much better than it was before, and there are many other search options. And so we can put in title, name, finding aid number. We don't have a separate field for record group, and I think that is a loss, but it will accept in keywords, something like RG10. So it is part of the search capability, but I don't think it's as good as it is. This is what the results are like. They're getting better. As I said previously, it was a very huge kind of conflated description with a lot of metadata that didn't concern researchers. But we get some good things going now, but it will also kind of conflate. You're not getting separate files here. Not always clear, again, how it sequences things. This is some script. The other thing it does is you'll get a number of record groups in here at the same time. I still have a fondness for the original one, which gave you a much more viewable search. This is the RG15 one, and you're getting a very useful description here, and you can get a number of these on. Ask for input. So recall this. A court case. The Crown Attorney, Dr. Tuff, you inspected an original copy of the library of this map. No, we obtained it in MNC numbers, National Map Collection from Library and Archives Canada. They have microfiche copies. We purchased the microfiche copies and then we scan them on a computer. I put it to you, Dr. Tuff. I requested it using your number. They told me they don't have a record under that number. Was I caught faking the evidence? And on a rare occasion where a witness gets to ask the lawyer the question, I asked, who did you talk to? I sent an inquiry to the National Map Reading Room, received information from your counsel that this was the map reading room. So this is the map in question. This is the number that was controversial. Fortunately, my lab was able to send up to me, and in fact, the National Map Collection of Archives has a map by this number. The issue was the existence of trails in here. He wanted this map out because it demonstrated Métis access to southern Alberta. I then attempted to find this just yesterday, and all my efforts to find this did not allow me to get to this document. And I tried the title of the document. It allows me to search other websites. I went back. I managed to get onto the old Archive.net. Got some descriptions. Got one that was very, very close. Old Archive.net came close. It was essentially the same map. But with the current database, we didn't even get close to this record. So it's no wonder that the Crown was confused, but also the people who answered the phone call did not know how to look for maps. So the elimination of public archives from the name is more than a signal. Since its inception, the federal documentary repository known as Public Archives Canada, to me, the change in name coincides with the neoliberal agenda of the 1990s. To borrow a term from Carl Polanyi, a double movement or contradiction can best describe the digital prospects for archival research. If done right, it has the capacity to increase research productivity and promote better understandings of the past, present, and future, to borrow from E.H. Carr's view of history.